Radio Westeros, Episode 88, Aegon's Conquest.
Spoilers all books!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Radio Westeros. I'm Lady Guinevere, and with me as always is Yoke Boy.
Yeah, hi everyone. Today we're back with our new episode about Aegon Targaryen's Conquest of Westeros, which we set out to write about 2 episodes back, only to find we couldn't discuss the Targaryen Conquest of Westeros without explaining how they came to be living on Dragonstone in the first place. And that led to an episode all about the doom of Valyria and the Targaryen migration to the edges of Westeros.
And now, with this episode, which does stand alone, we will cover the conquest itself, all the battles fought and the kings who fought and burned and died defiantly, as well as those who knelt or flew, and a single princess whose resistance led to the conquest being incomplete.
We left off last time at the moment Visenya Targaryen placed a crown upon her brother's head at the new Aegon fort at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush. And so, after a brief recap of the lay of the land in the Seven Kingdoms, we'll pick up the action when Aegon's first 3-pronged campaign set out from the Crownlands.
But first, as always, we thank our patrons. Radio Westeros is supported by patrons, and we truly couldn't do what we do without you. Thanks to all of you, including our Flaming Lightbringer patron, TJ Harrington, our Dragonsteel patron, Peter, and Pale as Milk Glass patrons, Alex, Akka and the Company of the Cats, Crispy the Song of Ice, Seth, Kelly, Sister Winter, Multude, Empty Walls, first of his name, and John Wargarian, as well as B-Word and Mr. J, the Bear and the Maiden Fair, and Sir Tim of House Jib Jab Hot Dog Shop, house motto, we forge the chains we wear in life.
And if you'd like to support the podcast, visit patreon.com/Radio Westeros, where you can pledge your support and get benefits such as early release, shout-outs, and exclusive content. And of course, your valuable support helps keep Radio Westeros going to the winds of winter and beyond. And now it's time to get started with Aegon's Conquest.
The Westeros of Aegon's youth was divided into 7 quarrelsome kingdoms, and there was hardly a time when 2 or 3 of these kingdoms were not at war with one another. The vast, cold, stony north was ruled by the Starks of Winterfell. In the deserts of Dorne, the Martell princes held sway. The gold-rich Westerlands were ruled by the Lannisters of Casterly Rock, the fertile Reach by the Gardeners of Highgarden. The Vale, the Fingers, and the Mountains of the Moon belonged to House Arryn, but the most belligerent kings of Aegon's time were the 2 whose realms lay closest to Dragonstone, Harren the Black and Argilac the Arrogant.
In episode 86, we cover the doom of Valyria and the events following, leading right up to Aegon's invasion of Westeros. We left off with Aegon Targaryen having landed at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush and the subsequent submission of a number of noble lords from the area that would become known as the Crownlands. That episode was meant to illuminate the particular circumstances that led to House Targaryen of Dragonstone being not only the dominant house in the region of Blackwater Bay, but also the sole surviving dragon lords in the known world, as well as the decision of their young lord to invade Westeros and unify its 7 quarrelsome kingdoms.
But in order for this episode to stand alone, and as a refresher for anyone who needs it, we want to do a quick recap of what was happening across Westeros prior to Aegon's landing. Recall that shortly before he set out from Dragonstone for the mainland, Aegon had sent the following message by Raven to all the kings and lords of Westeros. From this day forth there would be but one king in Westeros. Those who bent the knee to Aegon of House Targaryen would keep their lands and titles. Those who took up arms against him would be thrown down, humbled, and destroyed. At the end of episode 86, we saw the truth of the first part of that declaration in action in the newly carved-out Crownlands. Now let's look at the responses from the leaders of the 7 kingdoms of Westeros.
The north was ruled by the Starks, who had unified their own territory over the course of millennia, and unlike the other regions of the continent, it had never been conquered by foes from the south or across the waters. They were first men and proud of it, worshipping the old gods of their ancestors and keeping largely to themselves, protected by Moat Cailin and the swamps of the Neck and the rocky shores of their coastline. Torrhen Stark was their king, and, as we noted previously, like Aegon with Orys Baratheon, he was advised by a bastard half-brother, one Brandon Snow. Though it's noted that King Torrhen gathered his bannermen for a council after receiving word of Aegon's imminent invasion, silence was their immediate answer, and the north would not be a priority for Aegon, likely due to its size, location, and relative isolation.
Just to the south of the Stark territory lay the Vale, whose fertile valleys were protected to the east by a formidable mountain range, the Mountains of the Moon, and on all other sides by a rugged coastline that provided relatively few opportunities for a large-scale approach by sea. Since the Andal invasions, the Vale had been ruled by House Arryn. However, their current king was a young boy called Ronal Arryn, whose mother, Queen Shara, ruled as his regent. With its boy king, the Vale wasn't considered an immediate threat, especially since Queen Shara had responded to Aegon's declaration that he was now the only king in Westeros with an offer of House Arryn's support against their neighbor in the Riverlands, Harrenhal, in exchange for, quote, all the lands east of the Green Fork to the Trident. Easy enough for the Targaryens to leave that offer on the table and deal with the Vale in their own time.
In Dorne, Princess Merya Martell, known as the Yellow Toad of Dorne by her traditional enemy in the Stormlands, Argilac Durandon, had sat upon the Dornish throne for 6 decades. Directly descended from Nymeria of the Rhoyne, House Martell had more reason to fear Valyrian aggression than any other of the groups that had arrived on Westerosi shores from the eastern continent. Princess Merya responded to Aegon's Raven with an offer to join him against the Storm King, but as an equal and an ally, not a subject. Once again, the canny conqueror would ignore, or at least defer, giving any answer to the ruler of a region that was both remote and relatively thinly populated. As informed as he had made it his business to be on the politics of Westeros, it's highly likely that Aegon had seen that Dorne's long-standing history of border disputes with their neighbours in the Stormlands might be used to his own advantage as he dealt with King Argilac Durandon.
The Westerlands and the Reach were ruled over by King Loren I Lannister and King Mern IX Gardner, respectively. Though the two regions were longtime rivals and even enemies, under these two kings there had been a period of peace. Following Aegon's declaration of preeminence, it's noted that King Mern of the Reach rode up the ocean road to meet with King Loren of the Rock. Due to the alliance they ultimately formed, the two men would become known to history as the Two Kings, and they would eventually march forth to meet Aegon in the field, though not before the conqueror had dealt with the two kings whose lands bordered his own.
King Harrenhal, aka Harren the Black, of the Kingdom of the Isles and the Rivers, was the third generation of Ironborn rulers in the Riverlands. He was known as a cruel man who had plundered the Riverlands of money and materials and driven thousands of workers to their deaths in his decades-long quest to build the monstrously huge castle known as Harrenhal on the banks of the God's Eye. Black Harren's fortress had only just been completed the year Aegon launched his invasion. The native Riverlanders, a mix of First Men and Andals, had no love for their Ironborn overlords, and Harren's cruelties had not made the situation any better. Like his fellow kings, Harren called his banners when he received Aegon's declaration. But would the Riverlands rise for him?
The seventh king was none other than Argilac the Arrogant, king of the Stormlands. It was Argilac's attempt to use Aegon's ambition to shield himself from the aggressions of Harrenhal, which had disintegrated into mutual offense and culminated with Argilac behanding Aegon's envoy and Aegon summoning his council to Dragonstone, that had led to Aegon's decision to invade Westeros in the first place. Dealing with the Storm King would be one of the first priorities for the Targaryen invasion force, now established at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, and supported by at least two lords who were, nominally at least, liegemen of the Storm King, Lord Bar Emmon of Sharp Point and Lord Massey of Stonedance.
And so the newly crowned king of all Westeros and shield of his people would set out from the Aegon fort to bring his conquest to the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. Possessed of 3 dragons, perhaps it was a natural decision for Aegon to split his strength into 3 parts. Orys Baratheon would lead the greater part of their strength south into the Stormlands, supported by Queen Rhaenys and Meraxes. Daemon Valerian, Lord of the Tides, and Aegon's newly dubbed Master of Ships would take the royal fleet north, heading for Gulltown in the Vale and accompanied by Queen Visenya astride Vhagar. Aegon himself, along with his own dragon, Balerion the Black Dread, would make for the God's Eye in the heart of the Riverlands with a smaller force to deal with the threat that waited there like a knife at his back.
And so, up next, we'll cover the major campaigns of the conquest, region by region, as the people of Westeros learned what it meant to face dragon lords on the field of battle.
The king himself marched northwest to the God's Eye in Harrenhal, the gargantuan fortress that was the pride and obsession of King Harren the Black, and which he had completed and occupied on the very day Aegon landed in what would one day become King's Landing.
When Aegon demanded that the kings and lords of Westeros prepare to bend their knees to him as the sole overlord of a unified kingdom, Black Harrenhal retreated inside his brand new castle and called his banners. Harrenhal was and is the largest castle of Westeros and was apparently built as if to house giants. A number of point-of-view characters in A Song of Ice and Fire see it up close, and so we get some very good descriptions of its scale.
The curtain wall is described as so tall that only the tops of the castle's 5 massive towers can be seen behind it as one approaches the gates. Arya Stark thinks that the smallest of Harrenhal's towers is twice again as tall as the tallest tower of Winterfell, which rises above that castle's 100-foot tall inner wall, so a small hint at the scale there. The wall is sheer and built of black stone, quarried locally by thousands of captives who Black Harren is said to have worked to death. Those same captives cut local weirwood trees that had stood for thousands of years to make beams and rafters to support the towers and halls within. It was the lifeblood of those labourers and local superstition surrounding the destruction of the trees, as well as the fate of Black Harren, that would lay the foundations for a presumed curse upon the fortress.
Jaime Lannister notes that the outer wall is so thick that when passing through the main gate, one passed beneath at least a dozen murder holes. The gatehouse is noted to be as large as Winterfell's Great Keep, which is the building that houses all of the Starks' private chambers, as well as the Lord's Solar. This observation, of course, came from Arya, who seemed to measure all of the features of the massive structure against her home, which is convenient for us when considering its scale.
Within the walls lay the 5 enormous towers and the famous 2-story tall Hall of 100 Hearths, although Arya only counted 33 or 34 hearths when she tried to evaluate the accuracy of the name. The hall was large enough to entertain an army, and in fact would host the Great Council of 101 when all the lords of the realm were summoned to debate who should succeed Jaehaerys I. A round stone building with a domed roof housed the kitchens. Arya noted this to be as large as Winterfell's Great Hall, which can seat 500 people. There was also an armoury, above which was a huge hall known as Barracks Hall, where the castle's men-at-arms could gather, as well as a connected smithy which housed 20 forges, numerous other halls, undercrofts and yards, a mews, stables that could house 1,000 horses, a large bathhouse, a massive bear pit for entertainment, enormous underground vaults for food storage, an endless supply of water, and a 20-acre godswood, easily 6 or 7 times larger than the one at Winterfell.
Gildane refers to Harrenhal as Harren's pride and obsession, while Jaime Lannister thinks of it as Black Harren's folly. Catelyn Stark thinks of its scale and Harren's hubris and cruelty and the lives that it had claimed, concluding, strong it might be, but it was a dark place and cursed. And one of the main reasons for this so-called curse is what happened when Aegon Targaryen arrived at Harrenhal's gates.
Gildane remarks that all 3 of the armies which departed the Aegon fort encountered fierce opposition. Approaching the area around the Trident, Aegon's army was attacked twice near the south shore of the God's Eye, perhaps very close to the abandoned holdfast that Arya and Euron and the rest attempted to defend from Armory Lorch and his Lannister soldiers. The first attack, known as the Battle of the Reeds, was a victory for the conqueror, but not long after, 2 of Harren's sons led a party of Ironborn across the lake in longboats under the cover of night, with oars muffled to avoid detection, and fell upon Aegon's rear, inflicting heavy losses in a conflict known as the Wailing Willows.
Although the Targaryen army was taken by surprise, they returned the favor to Harren's Ironborn as they retreated back across the lake. Apparently, none of the Iron Men were experienced enough with wars involving dragons to remember to look up. And so when Balerion fell upon them from the morning sky, Harren's boats and his sons burned on the surface of the lake.
As Aegon's army approached Harrenhal, and in spite of those skirmishes, or perhaps because of them, his numbers grew. Consider Black Harren's history of cruelty and pillage in the region. When he had retreated behind his walls and summoned his banners, it seems that King Harren had expected that the Riverlords were so cowed by his strength that they would stand by him against the Dragon Lord. Instead, seizing the opportunity to rid themselves of the hated Ironborn once and for all, and sensibly taking to heart Aegon's message that, quote, those who bent the knee to Aegon of House Targaryen would keep their lands and titles, the Riverlords abandoned King Harren. Led by Lord Edmund Tully of Riverrun, the Lords of the Trident, Blackwoods, Mallisters, Vances, Brackens, Pipers, Freys and Strongs, raised Aegon's banner, summoned their levies, and joined their forces with King Aegon's.
By the time the army arrived at Harrenhal, it numbered 8,000 men, not to mention one very large dragon. Remember that by this time, Balerion was well over 100 years old, and while he would grow even more immense before his death in 94 AC, a 100-year-old dragon is still huge, on a par with Meleys in Vermithor, as we've seen in The Dance of the Dragons. In other words, extremely formidable.
We've mentioned Harrenhal's cruelty many times thus far, along with the fact that he was the 3rd generation of Ironborn rulers in the Riverlands, and that he did not possess the natural loyalties of the Riverlords. But let's take a moment to recap how it came to pass that Ironborn were ruling over Riverlords in the first place.
The story begins more than 300 years before the conquest. We often talk of the numerous quarrelsome kingdoms of Westeros of old, and with adherents to the faith of the Seven and worshippers of the old gods living cheek by jowl, the Riverlands were particularly prone to conflict. One such conflict occurred when Humphrey I of House Teague, king of the rivers and hills, with the support of the faith militant, began to repress the worship of the old gods in the region.
Lord Roderick Blackwood of Raventree Hall, whose First Men family had once ruled as kings in the Riverlands, rose in rebellion, and he was soon joined by other Riverlords, Lord Tully and Lord Vance of Otranto among them. On the point of being crushed by the Teagues, Lord Blackwood sent a call for aid to King Arlen III Durrandon at Storm's End. King Arlen had married a Blackwood, and was of first-meant descent besides, and so he led his banners across the Blackwater Rush, lifted the siege at Raventree Hall, and crushed House Teague in a series of engagements that would culminate in a battle known to history as the Battle of Six Kings.
Well, that name comes from the deaths in rapid succession of King Humphrey Teague, his 3 sons, and his only brother, each of whom ruled for a vanishingly short period of time before the death of the final Teague left Arlen III, the lone king, standing in the field. It seems that Arlen fully intended to restore rule of the Riverlands to House Blackwood, but Lord Roderick was killed in the battle, and his heir was an 8-year-old boy. As the Riverlords didn't seem to care to be ruled by a woman, Lord Blackwood's adult daughter Shira, Arlen III Durrandon made the fateful decision to absorb the Riverlands into his own domains, and so, for several centuries, the region was ruled from Storm's End.
But 3 generations prior to Aegon's landing, King Eric Durrandon's dominance of the Riverlands was challenged by King Harrenhal, known as Hardhand of the Iron Islands. Using the highly mobile Ironborn longships to penetrate the region's rivers from the west, Hardhand was able to defeat the Stormlanders decisively at the Battle of Fairmarket. King Eric, the grandfather of Argilac Durrandon, retreated to Storm's End, and neither he nor his son Arlen V were ever again able to make inroads into the Riverlands due to the vigilance of Harrenhal, who was said to have ruled from his saddle.
Hardhand was followed by his son Halleck, who was of a similar heavy-handed disposition, and he in turn was followed by his son Harren, whose focus, as we have seen, was not on subduing the Riverlords, but rather on building his enormous castle, a process which consumed his entire 40-year reign. The backstory between House Hoare and House Durrandon would prove to be of great importance to Aegon's conquest, since it might be said that Argilac Durrandon's crafty attempt to use Aegon to create a buffer between himself and his house's rival in the Riverlands contributed directly to Aegon's decision to subdue all of Westeros to his own rule.
And so it was that Harrenhal, having lost 2 sons to Aegon's counterattack upon their longships, retreated within the walls of his new fortress and prepared for a siege. However, like his sons, Harren failed to consider the realities of a war involving dragons, a situation which, to be fair, would prove commonplace all across the land. And yet, true to his word, Aegon wanted to offer the old man one last chance to bend his knee and keep his life and at least part of his lands.
With his army of 8,000 men surrounding Harren's castle, Aegon sent a maester to the gate to request a parley. Harren rode out with his banner-bearer and a maester to hear Aegon's offer. And because both men were accompanied by maesters, and maesters loved nothing more than writing things down, their exchange was recorded for posterity, as thus. "Yield now," Aegon began, "and you may remain as Lord of the Iron Islands. Yield now, and your sons will live to rule after you. I have 8,000 men outside your walls." "What is outside my walls is of no concern to me," said Harren. "Those walls are strong and thick, but not so high as to keep out dragons. Dragons fly." "I built in stone," said Harren. "Stone does not burn." To which Aegon said, "When the sun sets, your line shall end."
Gyldain relates that Harren retreated into his fortress and sent every man he had to the parapets, armed with the usual spears and crossbows, with promises of land and riches to whoever could bring down Aegon's dragons. Perhaps he forgot about the flames, or perhaps Gyldain is speculating madly since, as it happened, there would be no survivors amongst the defenders of the wall. After adding an offer of the pick of a daughter from any of the, in his view, treasonous Riverlords for the Dragon Slayer, Harrenhal retired to his tower, the largest and tallest of the 5, along with his surviving sons.
We do have to wonder if perhaps some servants, or indeed the maester, survived what happened next, given the way the story is related, since we also know that 130 years later, during the Dance of the Dragons, Lady Sabitha Frey would survive an attack on the same castle by Prince Aemon One-Eye riding Vhagar by hiding in a privy. It's probably safe to assume a handful of non-combatant survivors.
Gyldayn states that while Harren and his sons supped, his men watched the skies as night fell. Perhaps they took heart as it grew dark and no dragon appeared. But Aegon was clever and his dragon was black. As night fell, he took Balerion up above the clouds before descending inside the ring of the castle walls. And then it says, on wings as black as pitch, Balerion plunged through the night, and when the great towers of Harrenhal appeared beneath him, the dragon roared his fury and bathed them in black fire, shot through with swirls of red.
In his arrogance, Harren had thought himself safe behind his walls of stone. But along with the black stone that composed its walls, Harrenhal was built of wood rafters and was filled with other flammable materials, food products, hemp, firewood, wool and flax, animals, and men. Harren's iron men burned on the parapets, in the yards, and in their barracks. And while stone may not burn, if it gets hot enough, it will melt. Observers outside the castle reported that the towers of Harrenhal glowed red as candles against the night sky, and, like candles, they twisted and melted as molten stone ran down the sides and pooled in the yards below.
300 years later, Eyrie would observe numerous activities taking place in the Flowstone Yard beneath one of the towers. This was not a feature Harren had planned in his castle, but was rather a result of the night Balerion burned his towers to a molten running mess.
Harren and his remaining sons died in the tallest tower of his monument to hubris, a tower that would forever after be known as Kingspire, and Gyldayn reports that House Hoare died with him. This is technically not entirely true, though, since in A Game of Thrones, Lord Commander Jorah Mormont of the Night's Watch tells Jon Snow that during the conquest, Harren's younger brother was the Lord Commander at Castle Black. Lord Commander Hoare, with 10,000 Night's Watchmen under his command, had the good sense to remain at his post and keep his vows. It was only when he died, an unknown number of years later, that House Hoare became extinct. Their hold upon the Riverlands died that night, however, and the following day, King Aegon accepted oaths of fealty from the river lords who had joined him in the field.
Edmund Tully, the first to raise the dragon banner, was named Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, and his fellows swore fealty to him as their liege lord as well. And once the ashes of Harrenhal had cooled, Aegon had his men gather up the melted and twisted swords of the fallen Ironborn to be sent back to King's Landing, where a special fate awaited them.
For his part, Aegon would establish a camp beside the God's Eye, where he could receive news from the other campaigns that had set out from the Aegon Fort for the Stormlands and the Vale, even as he made his way into the Riverlands. And so now, like Aegon, let us turn our attention to the efforts of Rhaenys Baratheon and Queen Rhaenys in the Stormlands, and Daemon Valerian and Queen Visenya in the Vale.
Within days of his coronation, Aegon's armies were on the march again. The greater part of his host crossed the Blackwater Rush, making south for Storm's End under the command of Rhaenys Baratheon. Queen Rhaenys accompanied him, astride Meraxes of the golden eyes and silver scales.
As Aegon marched into the Riverlands to confront Harren the Black at Harrenhal, the bulk of his army headed south with Rhaenys Baratheon. With the king's half-brother went his sister Rhaenys and her silver dragon, Meraxes. This force crossed the Blackwater Rush near its mouth and made its way into the vast forest that once, along with the Rainwood of Cape Wrath, formed part of a huge primeval forest that covered much of southern Westeros. The Kingswood it's called today, and may have been called then, sources are unclear, but if so, it was a different king and a very different wood.
The Wendwater is the largest river of the region and more or less bisects the forest, with the modern Kingswood, that part that belongs to the Iron Throne and the Crown Lands, on its north bank, and the southern part of the forest stretching to Massey's Hook in the east on its south. A river crossing is, necessarily, a place where an army becomes dangerously vulnerable due to the separation of forces on both sides of the water. And indeed, as Orys's vanguard crossed the river, a strike force derived from the levies of Lord Errol, Fell and Buckler surprised them, bursting from the trees on the south bank and striking down 1,000 men before melting back into the forest.
And yet, as with Harrenhal and his sons in the Riverland, the Stormlanders did not account for the enormous advantage even a single dragon can provide an army. As they lurked in the forest, no doubt hoping to make further attacks, capitalizing on their local knowledge and gnawing away at the Targaryen force guerrilla style, Rhaenys took Meraxes to the air above and unleashed a wall of fire that quickly spread through the wood, quote, turning the trees to torches. Lord Errol was killed in the inferno, while Lords Fell and Buckler fell back, sending word of the airborne attack to King Argilac at Storm's End.
At his massive fortress on the coast, King Argilac was gathering his men. He was hampered somewhat by those who sought to take advantage of the distraction on his northern border. To his east, across Shipbreaker Bay on Cape Wrath, pirates from the Stepstones began raiding the shores, while to his south, Dornish raiders came down from the Red Mountains to harry the marches.
Nonetheless, the Storm King was still able to gather a large host of loyal bannermen about him, and while there would certainly have been a temptation to barricade himself behind the mighty curtain wall of Storm's End, when news of Harrenhal's demise arrived, followed by the reports from Lords Fell and Buckler in the Kingswood, Argilac showed his true mettle. It says, the old warrior roared that he did not intend to die as Harren had, cooked inside his own castle like a suckling pig with an apple in his mouth. No stranger to battle, he would decide his own fate, sword in hand.
And so Argilac the Arrogant, the Storm King, who in his youth had defended his realm against a Dornish invasion, fought against Volantis in the disputed lands during the Century of Blood, and later defeated King Garth VII, Gardener of the Reach, at the Battle of Summerfield, rode out from Storm's End to meet the Targaryen army in the field.
Argilac's army outnumbered the Targaryen force by nearly 2-1, with almost 4 times the number of knights and heavy horse. None of this would come as a surprise to Orys Baratheon, who received regular reports on the strength and disposition of the Storm King's army from Queen Rhaenys, who scouted their movements from the air. Orys chose a position on the hills below Bronzegate, Lord Buckler's castle, hoping to take advantage of the high ground and force the enemy to fight their way uphill to his lines.
As the defenders moved inexorably towards the invaders, it began to rain. By midday, the weather had turned into a gale, with wind-driven rain out of the south. The Stormlands were living up to their name, and many of King Argilac's bannermen begged him to delay their attack until the next day, knowing that the uphill battle in the driving rain would prove difficult for their horses. But Argilac was particularly enraged at seeing the Targaryen banner flying above his own hills, and cleverly noticed that while the rain was at his own back, it was driving directly into the faces of the army waiting above him. He commanded that the attack proceed, and so the battle that would become known as the Last Storm began.
The ensuing battle was much more of an actual battle than Aegon's taking of Harrenhal. The rain kept Rhaenys and Meraxes on the ground, and the fierce and bloody fighting went on into the night. 3 times Argilac led his knights uphill against Orys Baratheon's line, but with the rain turning the slope soft and muddy, the warhorses struggled and the attacks foundered. The Stormlanders had more success with spearmen, who could creep up the hill unseen due to the blinding rain in their enemies' eyes. The Targaryen army was pressed back, giving ground over a series of charges that found their archers useless due to sodden bowstrings, until on the 4th charge, Argilac and his knights broke through the center of Orys's line.
But once again, the forces opposing the Targaryens had no answer for dragons. Meraxes may have been grounded, but Rhaenys had kept her stationed near the centre of her half-brother's army. And so when Argilac's vanguard broke through, they found themselves face to face with the queen and her dragon, a terrifying obstacle even on the ground where their maneuverability was necessarily restricted.
But the Stormlanders' maneuverability was no less restricted, with the hills they had just battled up at their backs, and what they would have seen as a fire-breathing monster to their front. It was perhaps only natural that chaos and panic ensued. The first gout of Dragonflame engulfed the leaders of the vanguard, Dickon Morrigan and the Bastard of Blackhaven, as well as the king's personal guard. War horses trained to remain calm amidst the chaos and noise of battle turned and ran in terror. The charge that Argilac had hoped would smash Orys Baratheon's lines and reduce it to easily annihilated clusters of enemy soldiers became mud-soaked mayhem.
With the war horses fleeing from the dragon, many riders were thrown from their saddles, including King Argilac. Some time later, Orys Baratheon found him at the bottom of a muddy hill, battling 6 men, with as many corpses on the ground in front of him. Orys dismounted, according to Gyldayn, so as to meet the king on equal footing, and ordered his men to step aside so he could reiterate Aegon's offer to the Storm King, yield and recognise Aegon Targaryen as his overlord, and he would retain his lands and titles. Argilac the Arrogant, true to his name, refused and cursed him instead. The single combat that would decide the outcome of the battle began.
And so they fought, the old warrior king with his streaming white hair and Aegon's fierce black-bearded hand. Each man took a wound from the other, it was said, but in the end, the last of the Durrandon got his wish and died with a sword in his hand and a curse on his lips. The death of their king took all heart out of the Stormlanders, and as the word spread that Argilac had fallen, his lords and knights threw down their swords and fled.
It's not stated where the remnants of Argilac's army fled to. Perhaps some thought to return to their homes and await the fallout of their king's death. Perhaps some returned to Storm's End to defend their dead king's home and daughter. However many men from her father's army may have joined her, it is known that Argella Durrandon declared herself Storm Queen and barred the gates of Storm's End in the face of the advancing enemy.
It is said that for some days those outside the castle, and likely quite a few of those inside, feared that Storm's End might go the way of Harrenhal. And certainly that possibility was highlighted when Queen Rhaenys flew Meraxes into the castle yard under a flag of truce to parley with Lady Argella. But the self-proclaimed Storm Queen refused to surrender, telling the Dragon Queen, "You may take my castle, but you will win only bones and blood and ashes."
The difficulty with making statements like that is, of course, that one must be very certain of the loyalties of all the men you consign to fiery death in doing so. Perhaps the garrison at Storm's End might have died for her father, but Argella was not her father, and she was a woman. No one knows what discussion, if any, occurred after Rhaenys departed with Argella's defiant reply. But it is known that, with the coming of night, a peace banner was raised over the walls of Storm's End, the gates were flung open, and Argella Durrandon was delivered to Lord Orys Baratheon, quote, gagged, chained, and naked.
There's a huge irony in the fact that Argilac had apparently set Aegon on his path of conquest by attempting to use him as a shield between himself and his family's enemy, Harrenhal. Not that Aegon may not have already been contemplating the actions he eventually took, but it seems certain that Argilac's attempt at creating a one-sided alliance with the Dragonlord was the match to the powder keg that set Westeros aflame. And given that Aegon had replied to Argilac's original offer with a counteroffer that would have seen Argella Durrandon married to his half-brother Orys Baratheon, only to be bitterly and insultingly refused, the irony was magnified when Orys Baratheon received Argella Durrandon bound and gagged in his tent outside of her family's conquered fortress.
Had her father agreed to Aegon's counteroffer with anything other than violence, offence, and, well, arrogance, Argella Durrandon would have been married to Orys Baratheon and her family would have retained their lands and titles with no blood being spilled. As it happened, Argilac and hundreds, if not thousands, of his Stormlanders died in a vain attempt to defy the Dragon Lord, for what, in the end, was a nearly identical outcome.
Receiving the lady in his tent, the chronicles relate that Orys unchained her and wrapped her in his own cloak, pouring wine for her with his own hands. The language of the histories, in fact, suggests that no others were present when Orys, quote, spoke to her gently, telling her of her father's courage and the manner of his death. And though the historical record on the lady's thoughts remains silent, the eventual outcome was that Argella Durrandon married Orys Baratheon, at which point he assumed her house's words and sigil, took control of the Stormlands as their Lord Paramount, and together they became the forebears of modern-day House Baratheon.
And now, with the Riverlands and Stormlands both under the control of the Dragon King, it was becoming clear to the kings that remained in Westeros that their day to face the dragons was at hand. The next major engagement would take place in the Reach, but before we rejoin Aegon to the northwest of Storm's End, let's catch up with the Targaryens' third thrust from the Aegon fort, which saw Aegon's friend and kinsman and newly dubbed Master of Ships, Daemon Valerian, leading their fleet to Gulltown in the Vale, accompanied by Visenya and Vhagar to obtain the surrender of House Arryn.
The Targaryen fleet under Daemon Valerian left Blackwater Bay and turned north for Gulltown in the Vale. With them went Queen Visenya and Vhagar.
As her brother the king marched for Harrenhal and her half-brother and sister went south to confront the Stormlanders, Visenya and Vhagar accompanied the Targaryen fleet to the Vale of Arryn. Though we have yet to see it in person, in the main series Gulltown is mentioned numerous times as the principal port of the region, ruled by the Andal House Grafton, and as the birthplace of the fictitious Elaine Stone. Its deep harbour and sheltered anchorage have made it a trading hub since the days of the First Men, when it was ruled by House Shet. And of course, you can hear more exciting Gulltown action in the Vale section of our episode on the Andal invasion.
In recent history, loyal to House Targaryen, the Graftons of Gulltown led the resistance to their own Lord Paramount's defiance of the Iron Throne early in Robert's Rebellion. They attempted to prevent Robert Baratheon from leaving the Vale to return to his own fortress at Storm's End, and suffered an attack on their walls led by Jon Arryn and Robert himself, who slew the Lord of Gulltown, Mark Grafton, beneath his own walls.
At the time of Aegon's conquest, however, Gulltown was the locus of the Vale's initial resistance to Targaryen dominion. When Aegon sent ravens from Dragonstone, and by the way, a large group of ravens is known as a conspiracy, so when Aegon sent his conspiracy of ravens across Westeros, declaring his intent of being the sole king to all of its peoples, House Arryn had responded with an offer of alliance in exchange for all the lands east of the Green Fork of the Trident, currently held by House Hoare.
In this, the Arryns didn't seem so different from Argilac Durrandon, who sought to benefit from Aegon's strength against an historic foe. Where they differed is that while there was, at first, apparently no offer of a marriage alliance, there also seems to have been no commitment to acknowledge Aegon as overlord. Nor did this offer come from the King of the Vale himself. Ronnell Arryn, as we said, was a young boy whose mother, Queen Shara Arryn, ruled as his regent. It was she who offered to support Aegon against Harrenhal in return for lands that the Valemen had not the power to gain for themselves.
Because this offer was not couched in terms of aggression or resistance, it appears Aegon chose to offer no reply at first. Both Argilac Durandon and Shara Arryn had pointed clearly to who the true danger in the region was, and so we can see the framework of Aegon's three-pronged strategy revealed in the responses he received from the three regions closest to the site of his landing. Aegon would deal with Harrenhal personally. His half-brother, who had been personally insulted by Argilac Durandon, would see to the Stormlands. And because of the importance of Gulltown in keeping the Eyrie supplied if their western borders were sewed up, as Aegon most certainly intended it to be, the Targaryen fleet, supported by Vhagar and Visenya, would head there.
Perhaps there was a certain amount of hubris in the initial assault, or perhaps simply a lack of intelligence. In the waters off Gulltown, the Targaryen fleet engaged with a, quote, hastily assembled Arryn fleet, which had, however, been supplemented by a dozen Braavosi warships. The record doesn't tell us if those Braavosi ships were pressed into service, hired by the Valemen, or offered freely by the Braavosi. Given the history of Braavos and the Valyrian Empire, we think we can assume that, whether free or paid, the Braavosi sailors joined willingly.
Whatever the case, and the way in which they're mentioned hints that the Braavosi ships helped to turn the tide of battle, the engagement was a stinging defeat for the Targaryens, whose cousin and Admiral Daemon Valerian, Lord of the Tides, was among the dead. According to Gildane, a third of the fleet was destroyed, and another third captured by the Valemen. But the victory was short-lived, for as in the Riverlands and Stormlands, the defenders once again had no answer for the Targaryen dragons. When Visenya and Vhagar descended upon the Vale fleet in their moment of victory, their ships burned to the waterline.
Sensing weakness in the leadership of the Vale, the inhabitants of the Three Sisters, three small islands in the Bight, that is, the waters south of White Harbor and north of the Mountains of the Moon, chose that moment to make a power play of their own. The sisters had been nominally part of the Vale since their own war with House Stark many centuries earlier had ended with one of the kings of Mountain and Vale coming to their rescue and driving the Northmen away. The sisters were ruled then, as they are now, by House Sunderland.
Following the destruction of the Vale fleet at Gulltown, the sistermen renounced their allegiance to House Arryn and proclaimed their own Lady Marla Sunderland, Queen of the Sisters. With no fleet, House Arryn had no answer for this rebellion, and, at any rate, would soon have bigger fish to fry than House Sunderland. Aegon Targaryen was massing his forces in the Riverlands in preparation for whatever threat came next. The north remained unconquered, as did the Westerlands and the reach to the south. Ultimately, Queen Shara Arryn would choose to ignore the sistermen and reinforce her defences at the Bloody Gate, where the high road from the Riverlands entered the Vale.
In the meantime, Visenya Targaryen landed at Crackclaw Point. Crackclaw Point is a peninsula of land that projects into the narrow sea east of Maidenpool and Duskendale. To its north lies the Bay of Crabs, formed by the mouth of the Trident. To its south, Blackwater Bay at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush. It's a land of, quote, steep hills, black bogs, and piney woods, and its people were largely of First Men descent, intermingled with the blood of a handful of Andals who married the daughters of locals when conquest by force failed.
In A Feast for Crows, Brienne of Tarth meets Nimble Dick Crab, who's a native of the region, and he spends several chapters regaling her on its history. Among many entertaining tales he tells is one about Visenya Targaryen. Aegon sent his sister up to Crackclaw, that Visenya. The lords had heard of Harren's end. Being no fools, they laid their swords at her feet. The queen took them as her own men, and said they'd owe no fealty to Maidenpool, Crab Isle, or Duskendale.
Nimbledick goes on to describe the direct fealty of the houses of Crackclaw Point to House Targaryen that resulted from Visenya's promise, stating, "We bow only to our own lords and the king, the true king, not Robert and his ilk." And, after naming a number of specific men from the area who had served in the King's Guard or who died with Rhaegar at the Trident, he concludes, "We're all good dragon men up Crackclaw way."
Statements like those have interesting implications for the future of A Song of Ice and Fire, and their origin lies with the sensible men who bent their knees to Visenya Targaryen and her dragon nearly 3 centuries before nimble Dick Crabb made them to Brienne of Tarth. And so, having accepted the fealty of the lords of Crackclaw Point, Visenya set out for Stony Sept in the Riverlands, where she rejoined her brother and sister, along with both of their dragons, to prepare for the next chapter in their conquest.
In the west, King Mern of the Reach rode the ocean road north to Casterly Rock to meet with King Lauren of House Lannister.
As we mentioned earlier, when Aegon sent his message to the kings and lords of Westeros, Gyldain tells us that King Mern of the Reach rode north to confer with King Lauren of the Rock. This in itself was a slightly remarkable circumstance, so let's take a few moments to review why that is and how their unlikely alliance came about.
The Lannisters of the Rock and the Gardeners of the Reach had engaged in a low-level border scuffle for generations since each house had first consolidated power within their respective regions following the coming of the Andals. Thus, Lancel I Lannister led an army as far south as Old Oak, the seat of House Oakhart, located in the Reach along the ocean road just north of the Shield Islands, while his namesake, Lancel IV, led an invasion of the Reach that was foiled by Sir Wilbert Osprey, the Little Lion, at Red Lake. Both invading Lancels lost their lives in the process, which couldn't have endeared the Reachmen to the Westermen. That those very locales had once been claimed as part of the West before being absorbed into the Reach by the historic King Garth the Great can only have inflamed the minds of succeeding generations who engaged in these bloody and petty border skirmishes.
But by the time Aegon's message took wing across Westeros, the kings of the West and the Reach had not only enjoyed a number of years of peaceful coexistence, but they would have been aware of a number of things that would ultimately force them into a natural alliance. First, though the Valyrian freehold was no more, House Targaryen was a living monument of its former power and imperialist expansion in Essos. Aegon's ambitions, as outlined in his message, were an even more potent and specific reminder of Valyrian imperialism. And so, while the idea of facing dragons may have given them pause, based on the record, it seems most likely that when the two kings first considered Aegon's 3 dragons, they were dismissed as being too few to tilt the balance of power, especially when compared with the historical conquest of the freehold, which would have been supported by dozens, if not hundreds, of the fire-breathing beasts. In comparison, perhaps the prospect of a mere 3 of them didn't seem all that intimidating.
Second, the two kings would have known that Aegon would have to deal with the 2 aggressive and, dare we say, arrogant kings to his west and south before he could turn his attention to their own regions. With Dorne and the Vale being comparatively weak and making offers of alliance that were either ignored or openly scorned by the Targaryens, the 2 kings need not fear the invader being bolstered from those quarters, and no doubt would have hoped that the legendary belligerents who stood between them and Aegon would bleed the invader's force, which was composed mostly of newly conquered men anyway, and how loyal could those be?
And speaking of the freehold, the final thing that might have influenced the 2 kings both in their alliance and in their levels of confidence in the strength of that alliance could possibly be found in the annals of history. Gyldain, when describing the gold and silver mines of the Westerlands, remarks that the potential wealth of the region was well matched with, quote, the hunger of the freehold of Valyria for precious metals. And yet there does not seem to be any evidence of commerce or even contact between the rock and the freehold. Gyldain cites Septim Barth, himself citing a Valyrian text long since lost, in suggesting that the sorcerers of the freehold had a prophecy that said, quote, the gold of Casterly Rock would destroy them, and therefore avoided any contact with the region.
And so, if this prophecy were known in Westeros, perhaps it's possible that with the two kings, we have an example of leaders making assumptions and decisions based on prophecy, the perils of which are well known to readers of A Song of Ice and Fire. If King Loren was able to convince King Mern that his gold, the gold of Casterly Rock, would be responsible for the final destruction of the Valyrians and everything they stood for, then we might have a compelling reason for the two men to set aside the long-held animosities between their kingdoms and join together in opposition to Aegon Targaryen's demands. If so, it's a pity King Loren didn't have a view into what his descendants, Tywin and Jaime, would accomplish in the future. Would he have approached things differently?
As it happened, when King Loren and King Mern had their meeting at Casterly Rock, they agreed to stand together against the invader when the time came. King Mern returned to Highgarden, where he proceeded to call his banners, while King Loren did the same in the west. Once the armies were assembled, they marched, south and north respectively, to meet at Golden Grove, the seat of House Rowan, situated near the northern border of the Reach, about halfway between Highgarden and Casterly Rock. We don't know if word of Harren the Black's fate had reached the two kings before they set out from their respective seats, but by the time they arrived at Golden Grove, they must have known. The record is silent as to whether the facts of the matter gave them pause or served to stiffen their resolve, but given what came next, we can probably assume more of the latter.
We first hear about the host of the two kings and its size in Tyrion II of A Game of Thrones, the details of which are corroborated by Gildain. Together the two kings commanded the mightiest host ever seen in Westeros, an army 55,000 strong, including some 600 lords, great and small, and more than 5,000 mounted knights.
Gildain adds that King Mern boasted that the massive army was our iron fist, just before the host marched northeast to bring the battle to the would-be conqueror. With King Mern went all four of his sons, and both of his grandsons serving as squires. The army of the Reach also included Lords Florent, Oakhart, Peake and Redwyne, and was roughly half again as large as the army led by King Loren Lannister, so likely numbering well over 35,000 knights and men-at-arms. Among these men was the entire membership of the fabled Order of the Green Hand, a knightly order founded by House Gardner after the coming of the Andals many centuries before. Yandel notes that the order was composed of, quote, the greatest champions, men as pure and honourable and virtuous as they were skilled at arms.
And so the full flower of the Reach, and most of the West as well, marched overland from Golden Grove, making for the border of the Riverlands, somewhere along what in modern times is called the Gold Road. Given their trajectory, it seems likely that their goal was to catch Aegon unawares in the Riverlands, but Aegon apparently had a robust intelligence network and so would not be caught flat-footed. Instead, the two armies would eventually meet at a place perhaps 10 leagues south of Tumbler's Falls at the headwaters of the Blackwater Rush, the place where nearly 300 years later, Lord Mace Tyrell would join his army with that of Tywin Lannister to march on King's Landing and defeat Stannis Baratheon.
Aegon Targaryen was encamped on the shore of the God's Eye, still consolidating his support amongst the Riverlords and overseeing the disposition of Black Harren's lands and possessions. When word came that the Reach and the West had joined forces and were on the march, Aegon mustered his much smaller force, placing Lord John Mouton in command of the army and, mounting Balerion, headed south.
The Targaryen army, composed mostly of men who had only recently bent their knees to the Conqueror, was no more than a fifth the size of the army of the Reach in the West, both things the two kings were probably very well aware of. However, a smaller army will always be more maneuverable than a larger one, and so Aegon was able to move quickly to intercept the enemy. At Stony Sept in the southern Riverlands, both his queens, fresh from Storm's End and Crackclaw Point respectively, joined him along with their dragons. The three siblings watched from Dragonback as Lord Mouton led the army across the river at Tumbler's Falls and surged south.
The army of the two kings was coming cross-country through open plains and fields of wheat, ready for the harvest. On those plains, the two armies would come together. Seeing their intelligence about the relatively small size of Aegon's army confirmed, the two kings would have celebrated. With a greater than 5-1 advantage, and with more knights and heavy horse as well, the wide open field of battle seemed to favour them. There were no castle walls promising safety, only to become a fiery tomb, nor was there a high ground for the Targaryens to take advantage of, nor any rain or mud, both of which had famously aided them in their defeat of Argilac Durrandon.
The plan was, apparently, for the bulk of the infantry to swing around and encircle Aegon's army, flanking him on both sides while their heavy horse, the Iron Fist, punched through the center of his lines. And Aegon Targaryen obligingly arranged his smaller force in a crescent with spearmen in front, archers behind, and light cavalry on the flanks. It was what would be expected in a traditional battle array, and also was not a disposition that favored the Targaryen army. Lord Mooton was left in command on the ground because, quote, the king himself intended to do his fighting from the sky beside his queens. Aegon had also noticed the condition of the wide open fields, tall grass and wheat, and dusty ground that spoke of a general lack of rain in the recent past. In fact, it had not rained in over a fortnight, and the entire area was dry as bone.
It probably came as no surprise to those Westerosi who now had experience with dragon riders that King Mern had forgotten to account for the metaphorical high ground which a dragon lord could take advantage of, the sky. Instead, he had demanded the honour of leading the centre battle, giving command of his van to his son and heir, Prince Edmund. King Loren would take the right, and Lord Oakhart the left.
When the two kings sounded their trumpets, their army surged forward under a field of hundreds of knightly banners. Mern's younger son, Gawain, was his standard-bearer, and the sigil of House Gardner, a green hand on a field of white, led the way. Confident of their plan of battle, the Gardner-Lannister army fell howling upon the foe. Neither arrows nor spearmen deterred them as they swept towards the center of Aegon's army. But then came the fire from above.
From behind and upwind, Rhaenys and Visenya used their mounts to set the dry grasses alight, while Aegon strafed the advancing ranks with flame from Balerion's back. A dry wind drove the flames and smoke into the faces of the army of the two kings, while the smells drove their mounts into panic. With walls of fire advancing around them, the ranks began to come apart, while Lord Mooton and his men remained, upwind, ready to cut down any foe who made it out of the inferno.
300 years later, Tyrion Lannister would think about the Field of Fire, as the battle would be called by the singers who wrote about it. It was the only time that all three of the Conqueror's dragons took to the field together. Over 4,000 men died in the flames, and another 1,000 were put to the sword, while tens of thousands more suffered burns ranging from moderate to severe. Every single member of House Gardner perished in the battle, but for one nephew, who survived 3 days before succumbing to his burns, bringing the end of House Gardner's thousands of years' reign in the Reach.
King Loren of the Rock was more fortunate. Gildane says he rode through a wall of flame and smoke to safety when he saw the battle lost. And 300 years later, Tyrion thinks wryly of his gratitude that King Loren had, quote, escaped and lived long enough to surrender, pledge his fealty to the Targaryens, and beget a son. King Loren's surrender came the next day, when he was captured and brought before King Aegon. Loren the Last laid his crown and sword at the Conqueror's feet, kneeled before him, and rose as Lord of Casterly Rock and Warden of the West.
The Targaryen casualties at the Field of Fire were light. Fewer than 100 men died, and Queen Visenya took an arrow wound to her shoulder, from which she quickly recovered. Once again, as his dragons fed upon the dead, Aegon had the swords of the fallen collected and sent back to the Aegon fort. Aegon continued to accept the surrender of Lord Loren's bannermen and those lords of the Reach who had survived the flames. But with House Gardner now extinguished, There had been no formal surrender by the Reach, and so the conquest of the region remained incomplete.
Thus, Aegon took leave of his queens and headed at once for Highgarden, seat of House Gardner, in order to prevent it from falling into the hands of another recalcitrant lord seeking to oppose the Dragon King. He needn't have worried. Highgarden had been left in the hands of its steward, Harlan Tyrell, whose family had served the Gardeners, to whom they were distant cousins through the female line, since they arrived during the Andor migrations centuries before. Tyrell saw the lay of the land and lost no time in yielding the castle and pledging his support to Aegon. In turn, Aegon named Sir Harlan Warden of the South and Lord Paramount of the Mander, further granting him not only Highgarden with all its lands and incomes, but dominion over all the lords of the Reach.
Aegon had intended to continue on to Old Town and the Arbor and thence to Dorne, where he would join forces with Rhaenys to complete the subjugation of the South. But before he could leave Highgarden, word came that Torrhen Stark, king in the north, was on the move with an army 30,000 strong. The Northmen had decided to resist and had crossed the neck, possibly even as the flames of the Field of Fire still cooled, making for the river crossing at the Trident.
And so north Aegon went once more, sending word to his queens and to all of his new, recently acquired bannermen to assemble once again in the Riverlands. But now, before we go on, at the midpoint of the episode, it's time for us to give thanks to our patrons from the Valyrian Steel level.
Thanks so much to Aileen, Oxheart, Blithe Spirit, Archmaester Kobe of the Higher Mysteries, Cabot the Unfrozen, David Dean, Lord Sosa and his faithful canine companion Theoden, Dolorous Fred, Jill, J.M., Herbert Westeros, the Miskatonic Maester, Lady Silverwing, Infandaris, the Unspeakable Terror, Mark, Boss, Schwartz the Black, the Sithorian, Sally, Tristis Lorien, Wild Child of the Wolfswood, W, Sword of the Evening, and Lady Direliz of Castle Naki, the Alpha Patron. With both the Riverlands and Stormlands now under the control of Aegon the Dragon and his allies, the remaining kings of Westeros saw plainly that their own turns were coming. At Winterfell, King Torrhen called his banners.
Torrhen Stark, King of the North, ruled over a region as vast as the rest of Westeros put together. As Robert Baratheon would tell Ned Stark 3 centuries in the future, "In the south, the way they talk about my 7 kingdoms, a man forgets that your part is as big as the other 6 combined." The north, as we've mentioned, and is well known to any students of Westeros, is a singularly unique region in that it was never conquered by the Andals, and in fact they and their Faith of the Seven utterly failed to make inroads there, even by intermarriage with the First Men, as they did in so many other regions.
And so the North remained, stubbornly, a First Men culture, worshipping the old gods of their forefathers, praying to their weirwood trees, keeping to the old traditions, supporting the Night's Watch, and enduring one brutal Westerosi winter after another. House Stark, like many of the other ruling houses of Westeros, had consolidated their power in the region over centuries of attrition, aided perhaps by their connections with the Night's Watch on the northern border, and perhaps even an ancient relationship with the indigenous people known to them as the Children of the Forest.
Yes, speculation abounds that House Stark attained mastery over the art of skin changing, whether directly from the children or via intermarriage with other houses that had previously done so. And of course, they were instrumental in raising the wall after the Long Night. In fact, the Starks are intertwined with the legendary history of the North in a way no other house is, and certainly by the time of the Conquest, it would be impossible to think of the North without House Stark, and vice versa.
As we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, following Aegon's initial message to the kings and lords of Westeros, it was reported that Torrhen spent long days and nights consulting with his counselors and bannermen about what was to be done in the face of Aegon Targaryen's demands. Along with the rest of the realm, the Northerners watched anxiously as Aegon marched to Harrenhal, while his half-brother Orys Baratheon confronted the Stormlanders.
After the fiery fate of Harren the Black and the death of Argilac Durandon and subsequent surrender of Storm's End became known, it became clear that each king in Westeros would have their day. It was this resignation that led to the alliance of the two kings and to Queen Shara Arryn fortifying the bloody gates of the Vale and barricading herself and her family in the Eyrie. Torrhen Stark chose that moment to call his banners, knowing it would take time for them to arrive, given the enormous size of his territory.
In A Game of Thrones, we see Robb Stark call the banners of the North in preparation for marching on King's Landing to achieve his father's release. It was a process that took a number of weeks, and once the assembled force marched, it numbered somewhat over 20,000 men. Torrhen's army, when it marched, would number over 30,000, quote, savage Northmen, and they had crossed the neck and entered the Riverlands before Aegon was made aware of their movements.
Nonetheless, Aegon had the benefit of travelling on Dragonback, as did his sisters, and because he was able to summon men from all the regions he had recently conquered, who for the most part were still nearby or mobilised, Gyldayn tells us that by the time Torrhen reached the Trident, he discovered that a host half again the size of his own awaited him on the far bank. Aegon had succeeded in merging together Riverlords, Westermen, Stormlanders, and Men of the Reach, as well as his own Crownlanders, into an army almost as big as the one he had recently faced in the Reach. Encircling the skies above the camp were 3 dragons with their riders.
Torrhen Stark had clearly done his homework. Scouts and outriders brought back eyewitness accounts of the ruin of Harrenhal, its rubble still smoldering, as well as reports from the Field of Fire. He knew that 3 of the kings who had opposed Aegon and his dragons had died, and could plainly see that the only one who survived was Loren Lannister, who had wisely bent his knee. Unlike his fellows, who had failed to look up, Torrhen couldn't help but see the naked threat of 3 circling dragons, and to understand that not only he himself, but a great many of his kin and bannermen would suffer the same fate as the Ironborn at Harrenhal and the Gardeners of the Reach, if the Northmen pressed on with their attack.
Some of his advisors insisted that Northern Valor would win the day, while others suggested they retreat to Moat Cailin, the fortification at the neck that had protected them for so long against the Andals, and make their stand there. And Torrhen's half-brother Brandon Snow apparently offered to make his way into Aegon's camp under the cover of darkness and slay the dragons as they slept.
But in fact, in A Dance with Dragons, we get a pretty compelling hint that Brandon Snow didn't just make this offer off the cuff in the Riverlands, but had planned it well in advance, possibly with his brother's approval, or at least knowledge. When Bran Stark has a series of visions of scenes through the eyes of the Winterfell Heart Tree in A Dance with Dragons, one thing he sees is this: a dark-eyed youth, pale and fierce, sliced 3 branches off the weirwood and shaped them into arrows.
Fans speculate that the dark-eyed youth is none other than Brandon Snow, and that the 3 weirwood arrows were meant for Aegon Targaryen's 3 dragons. This raises the interesting possibility, as we mentioned, that the plan was to kill the dragons all along, and even that the army of 30,000 Northmen was a blind to cover a dragon-slaying mission. In which case, it's possible that the actual sight of the beasts gave the brothers pause, perhaps in combination with the overwhelming numbers of Aegon's army. The vision also raises the question of whether a weirwood arrow, presumably through the eye, would actually kill a dragon, or whether Bran and Torrhen were, in fact, just speculating that it might. That in itself would be a compelling reason for giving up the effort in the end, since without 100% certainty, any such effort would almost certainly be a suicide mission.
Well, in the end, Brandon Snow did cross the Trident. However, we're told he went with 3 maesters to treat with the Conqueror rather than 3 arrows to kill his dragons. Still, we cannot ignore the possibility that his mission with the maesters was also one to evaluate the possibility of success of the more covert option. In any case, the suicide and possible dragon slaying mission was abandoned, and we're told that messages, and more on that shortly, went back and forth throughout the night, and that in the morning, Torrhen Stark crossed the Trident, knelt to Aegon Targaryen, laying the ancient crown of the Kings of Winter at the Conqueror's feet.
As Loren Lannister knelt a king and rose a lord on a field in the Reach, so did Torrhen Stark kneel a king on the south bank of the Trident in the Riverlands and rise as Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. To this day, Torrhen is remembered as the King Who Knelt, and in the current timeline, an inn has been built at what is allegedly the site of his kneeling. The Inn of the Kneeling Man is seen several times in Arya and Jaime chapters in the Riverlands. But while much can be, and has been, said about whether Torrhen should have maintained his opposition to the Conqueror, no one could deny one salient fact. No Northman left his burned bones beside the Trident, and the swords Aegon collected from Lord Stark and his vassals were not twisted, nor melted, nor bent.
There are a few interesting postscripts to Torrhen's decision, though. First is that there may have been more to the messages back and forth than meets the eye. And so let's talk about the Song of Ice and Fire. In the past, we've speculated that in addition to Daenys Targaryen's fiery dreams, perhaps a broader prophecy was the motivator to House Targaryen's exodus from the Freehold, and maybe even specifically their relocation to Dragonstone, and the later decision of Aegon Targaryen to unify Westeros under a single king. Recently, HBO's House of the Dragon has revealed that knowledge of an apocalyptic prophecy known as the Song of Ice and Fire, something previously mentioned in the books only by Rhaegar Targaryen in Dany's vision in the House of the Undying, came directly from Aegon, and therefore, perhaps from his antecedents, through at least 7 generations of his descendants to Viserys I and Rhaenyra.
Yeah, and while we usually keep only to the books here, since this is information that came directly from George, we now consider it to be semi-canon, in light of which we have to speculate what Aegon's thoughts were about the North. Had he or his forebears made a connection between House Targaryen and House Stark as the totemic representations of the 2 elements by that time? Much later, during the Dance of the Dragons, Jacaerys Valerian will forge an alliance on behalf of his mother Rhaenyra with Lord Cregan Stark, called the Pact of Ice and Fire. So it seems clear that, by that time at least, Targaryens knew to associate Starks with the ice portion of the phrase.
All of which is to say that if the prophecy called the Song of Ice and Fire did inspire Aegon's drive to invade and unite Westeros under one leader, and if he had interpreted it in such a way that involved House Stark, whatever passed between the Conqueror and the King Who Knelt might have not only had an immediate bearing on the outcome of Torrhen Stark's mission to the Riverlands, but may have also been extremely interesting and even enlightening to those of us who are concerned with what's happening in Westeros at the close of the 3rd century since Aegon's conquest. And at least some of that conversation may have transpired through the intermediary Brandon Snow, perhaps even with the result of staying a potential dragon assassination attempt.
Another thing of note is that to this day, no one knows what happened to the Stark's ancient crown of winter. In the main series, after he's declared king in the north, Robb has a replica made for himself. We see it through his mother's POV. Her son's crown was fresh from the forge, and it seemed to Catelyn Stark that the weight of it pressed heavy on Robb's head. The ancient crown of the Kings of Winter had been lost 3 centuries ago, yielded up to Aegon the Conqueror when Torrhen Stark knelt in submission. What Aegon had done with it, no man could say. Lord Hoster's smith had done his work well, and Robb's crown looked much as the other was said to have looked in the tales told of the Stark kings of old, an open circlet of hammered bronze, incised with the runes of the first men, surmounted by 9 black iron spikes, wrought in the shape of longswords. Of gold and silver and gemstones it had none. Bronze and iron were the metals of winter, dark and strong to fight against the cold.
The original would have been a singular object, laden with associations of the North and worn by generations of Stark kings. It seems like it could even be a magical, or at least highly symbolic object in the future of the story, and so it seems extremely relevant that it is pointedly noted to have vanished into Targaryen custody 300 years ago. Some readers have speculated that perhaps Rhaegar Targaryen discovered it somewhere in his family's treasury and later returned it to Lyanna, in which case, could it be waiting for their son Jon in the crypts beneath Winterfell along with his mother's bones? Perhaps. Only time will tell.
And a final thing of note, and this confirms what we hinted at a few minutes back about there being dissatisfaction with Torrhen's decision, is that some number of men, and perhaps women, left the north in the wake of Torrhen's submission and formed a sellsword company in Essos known as the Company of the Rose, choosing exile over submission. The company is spoken of in the present tense, so it seems it still exists. Might we one day see or hear about them on page, and perhaps even find out if the rose was a significant northern symbol even before Bael the Bard, Lyanna Stark, and a famous crown of blue winter roses.
Once again, time will tell. And speaking of time, now it's time for us to part company with prophecy and speculation, just as Aegon parted company with his sisters after accepting Torrhen Stark's surrender. We'll catch up with Aegon again soon after his march to Oldtown, but first, we'll follow his sister queens on their own missions, Visenya back to the Vale of Arryn, and Rhaenys in the direction of Dorne and Sunspear, seat of House Martell.
Queen Shara of the Vale, regent for her son Ronald, took refuge in the Eyrie, looked to her defences, and sent an army to the Bloody Gate, gateway to the Vale of Arryn.
Following the Field of Fire, Shara Arryn took her family to the Eyrie, seeking refuge in the famously impregnable castle of House Arryn, perched on a high shoulder of Giant's Lance, the tallest peak of the Mountains of the Moon. Giant's Lance is stated to be 3.5 miles high. That's an astounding 18,000 feet, a match for Alaska's Denali, which is not only the tallest mountain in North America, but the tallest mountain in the world when measured from base to peak. So George is doing his usual excess in descriptions with the lance, and the Eyrie falls right along with that theme.
At the base of the mountain, the Gates of the Moon guard the approach to its flanks. Past the Gates of the Moon, a winding path of steps carved from the stone of the mountain lead up through 3 way castles. The path to the first, Stone, winds through the heavily forested lower slopes of the Lance. Stone is a typical fortified keep with 2 towers, an iron-bound gate, and a large castle yard. After Stone, the path to Snow, the second way castle, becomes steeper and trees become more sparse.
Snow consists of a single tower, a timber keep, and a stable, all guarded by a simple, dry stone wall. It's positioned in such a way that it commands the entire approach from Stone. Once past Snow, the path becomes extremely perilous. We see the entire approach through Catelyn Stark's point of view, and it's plain that, with no trees to act as windbreaks, the path is a desolate and dangerous place. As she journeys from snow to sky, Catelyn thinks, above Snow, the wind was a living thing, howling around them like a wolf in the waste, then falling off to nothing as if to lure them into complacency. She also notes that the steps at this elevation are cracked and broken from centuries of use as well as repeated freezing and thawing. The approach to Skye is positively terrifying to the uninitiated, especially the quote, high saddle between two spires of rock, blasted by winds and surrounded by nothing but a precipitous drop into air and sky, which even Catelyn's guide, Maya Stone, admits can be a little scary.
600 feet above Skye, which is essentially a curved dry stone wall protecting a narrow ledge and a series of underground storehouses and stables, the Eyrie can only be reached in one of two ways, through a ladder of sorts created by handholds carved into the face of a natural stone chimney, or via a basket on a winch chain. This is the reason that not only Lysa Arryn, but her far distant predecessor, Shara Arryn, who was also the mother and regent of a juvenile lord of the Eyrie, considered the Eyrie to be impregnable. No army could approach the Eyrie on foot, as they would be destroyed by the defences between the Gates of the Moon and Skye, should they manage to get that far. But Queen Shara, like many other monarchs in Westeros during Aegon's time, forgot to account for the dragons.
Instead, she sent the bulk of the army of the Vale to the Bloody Gate, strengthened the defenses at Gulltown, and tripled the garrisons at Stone, Snow, and Skye. In addition to the seemingly impregnable approach to the Eyrie itself, the Bloody Gate, which consisted of twin towers joined by an archway housing the eponymous gate, looming over a defile which could accommodate no more than 4 riders abreast, had defied 3 separate attacks by Halicor, father of the late King Harren, a generation past. Plus, with most of the Targaryen fleet destroyed in the earlier encounter at Gulltown, there would have been little fear of any massive attack coming by sea.
Then, feeling safely ensconced at the Eyrie, Queen Shara, who had once been known as the Flower of the Mountain, sent a portrait of herself to Aegon Targaryen with an offer of a marriage alliance, as long as he agreed to name her son Ronald as his heir. Aegon's reaction to her offer is not recorded, and it appears he chose to ignore House Arryn's second overture as he had done the first. Instead, while he and Rhaenys moved on to other destinations in the south, Aegon sent Visenya back to the Vale.
And so it was that, with all her defences carefully planned and ordered, Queen Shara was supported by no more than a dozen guards when Visenya Targaryen, fresh from the surrender of King Torrhen Stark in the Riverlands, landed Vhagar in the Eyrie's inner courtyard. When the queen and her guard rushed to confront the intruder, they discovered their young lord, King Ronald Arryn, sitting on the Dragon Queen's knee. Entranced with the dragon, the boy king asked his mother if he could go flying with her rider. No further threat needed to be spoken. Visenya smiled, and Shara, who smiled in return, sent for the crowns of the Vale, her own regent's coronet, her son's small crown, and the falcon crown of mountain and vale that the Arryn kings had worn for 1,000 years, before surrendering them, along with the swords of her garrison.
The conquest of the Vale was accomplished without any further bloodshed, and Ronald Arryn even got his dragon ride. Visenya took him 3 times around the Giant's Lance, and he landed safely back in the inner courtyard of his home, no longer a king, but Lord Paramount of the Eyrie. Ronald Arryn would be known as the King Who Flew, which upon reflection by his mother must have seemed a much better moniker than the King Who Burned.
But while Visenya was managing the relatively peaceful surrender of House Arryn, her sister Rhaenys was facing a much bigger challenge in Dorne. And so next we travel south to catch up with what happened when Rhaenys and Meraxes arrived in Sunspear.
The Queen's flight took her to Sunspear, the ancient seat of House Martell, where she found the Princess of Dawn waiting in her abandoned castle.
We mentioned earlier that the response of Princess Maria Martell to Aegon's message demanding fealty was an offer of alliance against the Stormlands, quote, as an equal and an ally, not a subject. While no reply had been forthcoming from Dragonstone, Maria Martell must have interpreted a reply of sorts from subsequent events, especially the defeat of Argilac in his home territory, as something like, "We do not need your alliance, and your time will come."
Departing the site of Torrhen Stark's surrender in the Riverlands, Rhaenys would have flown due south as she made her way to Dorne. Along the way, she would have passed over places that loom large in the main series: High Heart, Acorn Hall, Stony Sept, Tumbler's Falls, as well as the site of the recent battle that was even then becoming known as the Field of Fire. Continuing above the Reach, she would pass over more places that are relevant elsewhere in the canon: Bitterbridge, Ashford and Longtable, all of whose houses may have fought or even perished in Mern Gardiner's army. Finally, she passed over one of the furthest west portions of the Stormlands, so recently subjugated with the assistance of Rhaenys herself. Residents of Nightsong, seat of House Karen, may have looked up and seen the dragon overhead and trembled.
Or perhaps they smiled, given the Dragon Queen continued on towards Dorne, their ancient enemy. Just past Nightsong in the Dornish marches, Rhaenys came to the pass through the Red Mountains, which separate Dorne from the Stormlands, known as Prince's Pass. There a host of spearmen guarded the entrance to the pass, and this is a location we think looms especially large in the main series.
In Ned Stark's 10th chapter of A Game of Thrones, while lying feverish from an injury, he dreams, quote, "an old dream of 3 knights in white cloaks, and a tower long fallen, and Lyanna in a bed of blood." The dream continues: "There were 7 facing 3, in the dream as it had been in life. Yet these were no ordinary 3. They waited before the round tower, the red mountains of Dorne at their backs, their white cloaks blowing in the wind." And after he awakes, Ned thinks he had pulled the tower down afterward and used its bloody stones to build 8 cairns upon the ridge. It was said that Rhaegar had named that place the Tower of Joy, but for Ned it was a bitter memory.
This, then, is the tower that supports the spearmen who guard the entrance to the Prince's Pass, one of 3 fortifications in the pass, and the only one at which Rhaenys sees signs of a Dornish defense, though she did not engage with them. Instead, she flew over the spot where in all likelihood a far distant descendant of hers would be born, towards Kingsgrave, the seat of House Manwoody, historic kings in the region, probably of Firstmen descent. Kingsgrave likely refers to the death of a king of the Reach occurring nearby, and one of the 6 kings sent to the wall in golden fetters by Nymeria of the Rhoyne was a Manwoody. After Kingsgrave, which was apparently deserted, she would have crossed over Skyreach, seat of House Fowler, also Firstmen and former kings who went by the name Kings of Stone and Sky, who had submitted to Nymeria centuries before.
Once through the pass, it seems likely that Rhaenys angled southwest, passing between Ironwood, the seat of the second most powerful house in Dorne, at the bottom of another pass through the mountains known as the Boneway, and the Hellholt, seat of House Ulla, on the banks of the Brimstone River. She crossed over the red and white sands of the great desert of western Dorne, and alighted at Vaith on its eastern border. House Vaith, known as Lords of the Red Dunes, was founded by Andal adventurers who later bent the knee to House Martell. When Rhaenys landed before the castle, intending to demand its surrender, she found it empty but for a few women, children and old men.
When Rhaenys asked these small folk where their lords had gone, the only answer she could get was away. And so she continued on, following the River Vaith to Godsgrace, seat of House Illyrian, who had once counted House Martell among their vassals, where the same situation presented itself. At Godsgrace, the River Vaith merges with the Scourge to form the Greenblood, which Rhaenys then followed east to the sea. There she found the Planky Town, a settlement formed by descendants of the very Rhoynar who had once fled the Dragon Lords of Essos with their princess Nymeria. There, too, only women and children remained to greet her, and the Dragon Queen flew on, now making for Sunspear, seat of House Martell.
And at last, at Sunspear, Rhaenys found someone she could deliver her message to. The 80-year-old Princess of Dorne, Maria Martell, waited for her in the abandoned castle. Maria was blind and infirm, and had sat the throne of Dorne for 60 years. But, as Gyldayn says, neither age nor blindness had dulled her wits.
When Rhaenys formally demanded the submission of House Martell and Dorne to her brother as overlord, Princess Meria replied, "I will not fight you, nor will I kneel to you. Dorne has no king. Tell your brother that." This answer was no doubt informed not only by the wisdom of age, but by the history of Meria's ancestor, Nymeria of the Rhoyne, who had fled Valyrian aggression centuries before. Nymeria, too, had declined to fight the Dragon Lords and had seen what happened to her countrymen who followed Prince Garin of Croyane into battle against them. In case you missed our recent episode on Nymeria and the Rhoynar, Garin ended up facing 300 dragons and their riders. Having just seen the destruction that a mere 3 dragons can cause, we can only applaud the wisdom of both Nymeria and Meria seeking to preserve their people from certain death.
But Rhaenys would not be deterred. She promised to relay the message, but added, "We will come again, princess, and the next time we shall come with fire and blood." To which Meria answered, "Your words. Ours are unbowed, unbent, unbroken. You may burn us, my lady, but you will not bend us, break us, or make us bow. This is Dorne. You are not wanted here. Return at your peril."
And so Rhaenys left Sunspear, deferring the conquest of Dorne to fate and another day. And now, finally, let us return to the Reach and beyond as Aegon and his sisters tie up a handful of loose ends and establish their dynasty at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush.
To the west, Aegon Targaryen met a warmer welcome. When Aegon and his host approached Old Town, they found the city gates open and Lord Hightower waiting to make his submission.
After wrapping things up in the Riverlands, Aegon turned back to the Reach. He had intended to continue to Old Town and thence to Arbor in the Dorne, following his visit to Highgarden to accept the surrender of House Tyrell, but Torrhen Stark's march south had interfered. Now, with the Starks surrendered and sworn to fealty, Aegon could go south with no enemies at his back save the Vale, and he certainly would have expected Visenya to make short work of that.
And so he marched unopposed to Old Town. The largest city in Westeros, Old Town was walled and ruled over by House Hightower of the Hightower. The Hightower is the tallest man-made structure in Westeros, even taller than the Wall, which is to say it is likely taller than a 50-story building. The Hightower is, in essence, a lighthouse with a beacon at its top that can be used to guide ships into the port of Old Town or to summon House Hightower's bannermen to war. Below the step tower, the foundation is formed by a square fortress fashioned from black stone that is reminiscent of the stone used in Valyrian roads and the Black Wall of Volantis.
The High Tower is located on Battle Isle at the mouth of the Honeywine. The name of the isle is of uncertain origin, though local legend claims that dragons once roosted on the island until ancestors of House Hightower arrived and drove them away. To add a possible Valyrian connection, there are maesters of the Citadel who claim Old Town began as a trading outpost of Old Valyria, though many others deny that Valyrians set foot in Westeros so long ago. However it happened, the ancestors of House Hightower were first men who ruled the area around the Whispering Sound as kings before being brought into the Kingdom of the Reach by Garland II Gardner.
In spite of the first-man origins of the Hightowers, Old Town in Aegon's day was the centre of the faith of the Seven in Westeros. The High Septon, terrestrial voice of the Seven, presided over the faithful, who numbered in the millions across Westeros, from his seat in the Starry Sept, as his predecessors had done for 1,000 years before the arrival of the Targaryens. And it was in the Starry Sept that the High Septon, upon receiving news of Aegon's landing, had sought the guidance of his god for 7 days and 7 nights.
It is reported that the High Septon spent his time fasting and praying before each altar of the seven faces of his god, and allegedly it was the crone who showed him the answer on the seventh day, quote, lifting up her golden lamp to show him the path ahead. If Old Town took up arms against Aegon the Dragon, his High Holiness saw, the city would surely burn, and the High Tower and the Citadel and the Starry Sept would be cast down and destroyed.
While many would argue that it needn't have taken 7 days of prayer nor a divine intervention to arrive at that conclusion, it was the High Septon's declaration of his vision that not only stayed the blades of the powerful faith militant, but led to Lord Manfred Hightower's decision that none from Old Town would oppose the Dragon Lord. And so no Hightowers marched with the Gardener host, and when Aegon approached the city at last, he found the gates flung open to him and was greeted by Lord Manfred, offering his sword, the city, and his fealty.
And so it was that 3 days later, the High Septon received Aegon in the Starry Sept, anointed him with 7 oils in the time-honored tradition of the faith, and placed a crown upon his head, naming him Aegon of House Targaryen, the first of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the 7 Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm. That Aegon's new and improved style explicitly included not 1, but 2 references to Dorne, as the only place where Rhoynar could be found, and as the 7th Kingdom, must be viewed as a promise of things to come, for, as we just saw, Rhaenys had not managed to obtain the surrender of Sunspear.
While Aegon had been crowned by his sister queens at the Aegon Fort after he had secured the territory around the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, attended by a dozen or so newly conquered lords and the allies who had accompanied him from Dragonstone, his second coronation was witnessed by hundreds in the Sept and acclaimed by tens of thousands in the streets of Old Town. And it is from this second coronation, witnessed by the maesters of the Citadel, not from the first, smaller affair back east, that history books count the beginning of Aegon's reign.
But even setting Dorne aside for the moment, as Aegon did, and we must, there still remained areas of Westeros that had notably not submitted to the dragon's rule. Back in the Vale, where Visenya had obtained the surrender of the Arryn crown, House Sunderland of the Sisters had declared their trio of islands in the Bight an independent kingdom and named Lady Marla Sunderland as their queen. While the subjugation of the sisters might have reasonably been left to their liege lord at the Eyrie, the Vale had no fleet since Visenya burned it following the battle off Gulltown, and so Aegon commanded his new Warden of the North to see to the situation and end the Sistermen's rebellion.
Not long after, a northern army under the command of Sir Warwick Manderley departed White Harbour on a fleet of hired Braavosi galleys. That the Braavosi, who had lost a dozen ships to Vhagar's flames at Gulltown, and had more reason to hate Valyrians and their dragons than most, would lend their ships to Aegon's business, either speaks to the power of coin or to the persuasive powers of Lord Manderley, who, as the leader of the North's only port city, likely had an established trading relationship with the Braavosi.
It's reported that when the Sistermen spied the sails of Sir Warwick's fleet, followed by, quote, the sudden appearance of Queen Visenya and Vhagar in the skies above Sisterton, they knew their day had come. Steffan Sunderland, the younger brother of Queen Marla, met Visenya when she landed and bent the knee, delivering 2 sons as hostages to be fostered at White Harbour and the Eyrie, respectively. Marla Sunderland was exiled and imprisoned. For reasons about which we can only speculate, the histories tell us that after 5 years she had her tongue removed and was sent to the Silent Sisters. Our speculation is that, even as a prisoner, Lady Marla continued to make treasonous claims, leaving her jailers no other choice but to silence her forever. Such speculation will likely never be confirmed, and all we can say for certain is that thereafter, Lady Marla spent her days tending to the noble dead with her other sisters in the faith.
Far from the Bight, on the other side of Westeros, chaos had reigned on the Iron Islands since the destruction of House Hoare at Harrenhal. Long before they had ventured into the Riverlands, House Hoare had ruled the Iron Islands. when Harren's line was snuffed out by Aegon, a distant cousin, one Corin Volmark of Harlaw declared himself the heir to what was called in the Isles the Black Line and claimed kingship of the Iron Islands.
However, on Old Wick, where the bones of Naga the Sea Dragon lay and Kingsmoots had been held of old, priests of the drowned god elevated one of their own, a barefoot priest called Lodos, who was given a driftwood crown and proceeded to proclaim himself the son of the drowned god on earth and a worker of miracles to boot. Even this was far from definitive, as other claimants came forth on other islands. On Great Wick, Pike, and Orkmont, various contenders fought over the honor of being called King of the Iron Isles, until it was said that, quote, the waters between the islands were so choked with corpses that krakens appeared by the hundreds, drawn by the blood.
On the Iron Islands, it fell to Aegon Targaryen to personally put an end to the fighting and bring the Ironborn into his realm. More than a year after his coronation at Oldtown, Aegon arrived at Harlaw, riding Balerion and accompanied by a fleet composed of ships from the Arbor, Highgarden, Lannisport and Bear Island. Aegon personally slew Corin Volmark with Blackfire and then confirmed his infant son as his heir, on Harlaw alone. On Old Wick, Lodos attempted to summon krakens from the deep to sink the Dragon King's ships. When they failed to appear, Lodos filled his pockets with stones and walked into the sea, purportedly to seek his father's counsel. Thousands of faithful Ironborn followed him, to no result other than that their bloated bodies would wash up on the shores of Old Wick for years to come, a potent reminder of the failures of their drowned god and his priests.
The Iron Islands were never a thickly populated place, and after their losses in the Riverlands and many long months of infighting, followed by the mass suicide of thousands of Lodos' followers, it's perhaps no surprise that there remained little for Aegon to do, since most of the islanders welcomed an end to the chaos. All that remained was to settle the issue of who would rule the islands for the king.
Some of Aegon's councillors suggested the Iron Men be made vassals of Riverrun, poetic, or that they be administered from Casterly Rock or even Winterfell. Aegon heard all of this advice, but in the end, perhaps sensitive to the long history of raiding and petty warfare between the Ironborn and their mainland neighbours, he made the decision that they could choose their own Lord Paramount. In the end, the Iron Men chose Vicon Greyjoy, Lord Reaper of Pike, to be their leader.
House Greyjoy claimed descent from the Grey King, a legendary ruler from the Age of Heroes, the Ironborn equivalent of Bran the Builder or Garth Greenhand, and Lord Vicon was a famous captain, notably stern but also cautious. He was granted control over the islands only and renounced any claim to holdings on the mainland formerly held by House Hoare. He would prove to be a loyal and competent Lord Paramount who forbade reaving in the waters around Westeros and permitted septons back on the islands for the first time in generations.
King Aegon would bestow Harrenhal and its properties upon his master-at-arms from Dragonstone, one Sir Quentyn Cohoris. House Cohoris was of Valyrian descent, and Aegon must have felt the need for someone he could trust implicitly to occupy the largest castle in the Riverlands. The new Lord Cohoris was required to acknowledge Lord Edmund Tully as his overlord, and, as he was a widower, he also agreed to take one of Lord Tully's daughters to wife.
And so, with many loose ends settled, only the question of Dorne remained. Although Aegon claimed the title Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, and even Gildain reverently proclaimed that the Seven Kingdoms of Westeros were hammered into one great realm by the will of Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters, Dorne would remain outside the realm for years to come. The conquest of Dorne would not be accomplished in Aegon's lifetime, nor even in his children's and grandchildren's lifetimes. But it wouldn't be for want of trying, nor for personal sacrifice by the blood of the dragon. But that's a much bigger story than we can address here, so stay tuned for an episode chronicling the Dornish Wars of House Targaryen coming your way later this year.
And up next, in our final section, we look at the big picture for Aegon, now ruler of a vast and diverse kingdom, and how he decided to build his capital on the banks of the Blackwater Rush, where he had first landed several years earlier.
In the end, though, Aegon's enemies had no answer for his dragons.
When Aegon was crowned at Oldtown, there were many in the Reach and beyond who thought that the new king might make his seat there once his wars were concluded. What better place for a high king to sit than in the largest and oldest city in Westeros, and one with rumoured Valyrian roots to boot?
Others were certain that Aegon would eschew the West and return to Dragonstone, his house's ancient seat and home to many of its dragons. To the surprise of all of these odds-makers, Aegon announced his intent to build his court at the site of his landing in the town which had already spread to 3 hills that sat at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush.
Appropriately, the new town would be called King's Landing, and Aegon's seat would be located on the hill already known as Aegon's High Hill. Atop this hill, in the previously constructed Aegon Fort, the new king had caused all of the swords collected from his defeated enemies, both those who burned and those who knelt, to be delivered into a massive hulking pile said to number over 1,000 blades that were destined to be joined together to form a throne that Ned Stark would one day describe as an ironwork monstrosity of spikes and jagged edges and grotesquely twisted metal. The Iron Throne.
While the singers would tell of Aegon and Balerion forging the Iron Throne with dragon flame, the reality is that it was put together by castle armorers on a high platform in what would be Aegon's throne room. The massive and asymmetric throne was meant to be a potent symbol of Aegon's conquest, but also a reminder to the new king and his successors. It was meant to be uncomfortable and even perilous because Aegon believed, quote, a king should never sit easy.
While Aegon had his first castle raised on the hill that bore his name, the hills named for his 2 sister wives were being occupied by a variety of such institutions as one would expect to find in any city. Visenya's Hill would be crowned by a Grand Sept, financed by the High Septon in Oldtown, early in Aegon's reign. It was important that the faith, so instrumental in bringing about Aegon's acceptance in the Reach and his second official crowning, have a visible presence in the king's new capital.
In modern times, Visenya's Hill is also home to guilds of craftsmen, and in particular the alchemists and armorers guilds. Since Visenya was the more warlike of the 2 sisters, and was reputed to dabble in sorcery later in life, we think that these associations are not accidental and possibly originated during her lifetime.
Over on Rhaenys' Hill, we cannot know what existed there during her lifetime, as it's not specified, but we do know that in succeeding generations it housed the famed Dragon Pit, stable to the Targaryen dragons, as well as the city's pleasure district, the Street of Silk, where brothels and entertainments of all degree were to be found. Since Rhaenys was known to love riding her dragon, as well as pleasure, beauty, music and poetry, perhaps these too were natural associations that originated in her lifetime or from her inspiration.
Building King's Landing would take generations, with the walls being completed more than a quarter century after Aegon's landing, while the new and grander castle that replaced the Aegon Fort, the Red Keep, was begun just 2 years before Aegon's death and completed in the reign of his son Maegor. But with their conquest of at least the majority of Westeros, the Targaryen dynasty had been established and would stay, for better or for worse, enthroned on their uncomfortable chair at the top of Aegon's High Hill for nearly 3 centuries after Aegon sent that first wagonload of twisted swords back to his fort from Harrenhal.
Early in this chronicle of Aegon's Wars of Conquest, Gyldayn makes the highly pertinent statement that, in the end, Aegon's enemies had no answer for his dragons. Over and over again, the truth of that one advantage played out as the lords and kings of Westeros either failed to look up or did so and realized the futility of opposing such naked power. This would continue to be the case for House Targaryen for generations to come, except on the two occasions where they fought each other, once during the reign of Aegon's son Maegor, and much later following the reign of his great-great-grandson Viserys I, when his descendants would all but destroy themselves fighting over Aegon's Iron Throne.
But that's a story for another episode. Or 7, in fact. As many of you know, we've been working on our series covering the Dance of the Dragons with our friends at History of Westeros for some time now, and you can look for the 7th and final episode in your feeds later this year. And that concludes this episode, second in a 2-part series exploring what brought the last Dragon Lords of the Valyrian Freehold to Westeros' shores and how they established a 300-year dynasty there. Thanks so much for joining us today. As usual, we'll end the episode by giving credit where credit is due. Thanks to George R.R. Martin for having Aegon and his sisters conquer Westeros, and to Kevin MacLeod for allowing us to use his music in our production. And we want to thank our patrons from the Castle Steel level. If you enjoy the podcast, consider being a patron, and you could be hearing your name here too. Our heartfelt thanks to Tori Loon, AJ, Aegon VI, Alex, Ali B, Oakenfist, Brian, Casey, Cassandra, Charitable Rereadings, Lady Amalthea, Chris, Christian, Sir Clint Theandel, Convenience or Death, Courtney, David, Darian, Dimitri B, Dennis, Lady Diana Dane, Esme, Liza, Emily of the Eyrie, Ezra, Felix, Gerald Garcia, Sir Gladworth, Sir Gregor the Toasty, Lord of the Breadfort, Engvild, Jim McGeehan, Something Like a Lawyer, Winter's King, John Aris, Rider of the Ice Dragon, Cenarion the White Storm, Ara Finway and Glorion, Judson, Katie, Kenneth, Tree Girl, Sir Galahoo of What, Kyle, Laura, Lena Snow, known as the Twilight Star, Lemba, Lynn, Lomas Knight Rider, survivor of the Yeen Sleepover, Lord Leighton with the Highest Tower, Mage Marmot, Monero Geek TV, Maria, Margareta, and our cohort of Matts, Matt A, Matt C, Matt K, Matt L, Matt M, Matt R, as well as Beatrix Rainfall, Maester Mary, Molly, Nimble Nick One Iric, Peter Pebble, Peter, PJ, Paul B, Paul H, King Ray, first of his name, Richard, Rickle Pickle, Sam, Sir Swift the Peppered Knight from the House of Black and Grey, Sir Larcelot of Bee Hill, Cern, the Rat Chef de Cuisine, Terry, Sir Terence, Knight of the Cedars, Steph Lioness, Val and Valentine, Maiden of the Black Frost, Vance, Corin Halfhand, and Yvonne. As always, let us know if I've pronounced any of your names wrong. If you have a nickname you